welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the complicated question of how the duchies Schleswig and Holstein should be governed and by whom was decided. The Danish government once again tried to enforce its control in the half-Danish Schleswig, but this led to a new war in 1864. This time, Russia, France and Britain stayed out of it, so the Prussians, under the leadership of the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, could crush Denmark, occupying not only the duchies, but all of Jutland as well. As a result, the unitary state was dissolved, the duchies came under Prussian and Austrian control and joined the German Confederation. The Prusso-Austrian chumminess would soon end in the war that resulted in the collapse of the Confederation, but Schleswig and Holstein would remain beyond the reach of Copenhagen, so we won't go into that here. Today, we'll instead look at what happened in what was left of Denmark after the loss of the duchies. The Danes were faced with a new reality as a mono-ethnic, truncated mini-state with a new dynasty on the throne. There were quite a few Danes who were skeptical about this new king of theirs, Christian IX. Perhaps not primarily because he came from a cadet branch of the extinct royal family, but because he was German. And in the light of recent events, it's perhaps not entirely impossible to see why his Germanness was a problem to many Danes. Episode 134, The Father-in-Law of Europe. Ever since Denmark became a hereditary kingdom in the 1660s, the succession had been regulated by the so-called King's Law. That's not very surprising, since basically all Danish legislation fell back on the King's Law, which basically said that the king decided the law. To be eligible for the crown, you had to be a descendant of Frederick III, who was king at the time when the King's Law was passed. But why am I bringing this up now? As I've mentioned several times already, Christian IX belonged to a poor, if ever there was an illustration of the saying, everything is relative, but still poor and distant branch of the royal family tree. But just so you understand exactly how distant his branch was, his connection to the royal family was through his father, obviously, whose ancestors had been branched off from the main line 9 generations back during the time of Christian III. We're talking the first half of the 1500s here, back when the Danes had just ditched the Pope and become Protestants. See where I'm going with this? Technically, Christian wasn't eligible to inherit the throne according to the King's Law because his line of the royal family had branched off about a century before Frederick III and his power grab that led to more than 200 years of Danish absolutism. Through his mom, you could trace Christian to the kings of Denmark a little faster since his mother was the great-granddaughter of Frederick V. But since women couldn't inherit the crown, that didn't count legally, even though it did boost his cred somewhat when the Danes were looking for someone to replace the childless buffoon Frederick VII. But even if you take his mother into account, Christian still wasn't first in line to become king, because he had older brothers. Christian was actually the 4th son, so even if his line was deemed acceptable, there were 3 older brothers who should have been offered the job of king before him. So why was Christian chosen? Well, there were a few reasons. None were technically valid, but they still made a difference. As so often is the case, it was all about love and politics. We can start with the more tangible factor, namely love, or at least marriage. Even though he came from the obscure undergrowth of the Danish royal family tree, Christian had always aspired to marry well. When he attended Queen Victoria's coronation in London in 1838, he actually suggested that they should get married, he and Victoria. She turned him down though, and instead married Albert 2 years later. Christian and Victoria would, sort of, become family later in life, but we'll get back to that in a few minutes. 4 years after he failed to secure the hand of the Queen of England, Christian married Louise of Hesse-Kassel. Her father, Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, was a general in the Danish army and the governor of Copenhagen. Louise's mother was the cousin of King Frederick VII and therefore his closest living relative. So this way, Christian came even closer to the Danish throne. But, just like Christian, his wife Louise wasn't her mother's eldest child. She had an older sister and an older brother. but all three of them, mother, brother and sister, renounced their claim to the Danish crown in order to make way for Christian and Louise. Very big of them. There were actually still other candidates with stronger claims to the throne. One of them was Prince Frederick of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg. He belonged to another cadet branch of the now extinct Oldenburg dynasty, but it had branched off later than the Glücksburgs, and they were actually eligible to inherit the crown according to the king's law. But, as you might remember from episode 132, Prince Frederick had joined the rebels in Holstein back in 1848, and as Minister of War, he had been fighting the Danish army. He was the commanding officer who captured Rendsburg Fortress at the beginning of the 3 Years' War, remember? This fighting against Denmark made him enormously unpopular among the Danes. Maybe you saw the picture on the chamber pot I posted on social media with the image of Frederick and his brother being hanged at the bottom of the pot. For political reasons, no one with such strong anti-Danish credentials would be a possible candidate for the throne in Copenhagen. So Christian was elected king, even though his royal credentials were shaky. And so were his Danish ones. It's true that he'd never been an outspoken German nationalist or actively fought against Denmark, but that's a pretty low bar to pass. The fact remained that he'd been born in Schleswig into a German-speaking family and environment, and for Christian, home remained German Schleswig. Already last time, we saw how he was willing to compromise Danish independence in order to preserve the unitary state, so he could remain Duke also of Schleswig and Holstein. Even though people didn't know of his plans to sacrifice Danish independence to keep Schleswig, he was still fairly unpopular when he ascended the throne because of his Germanness. Denmark now lived in the new reality, in the threatening shadow of growing German power, and at the same time, many dreamed of revenge and harbored unrealistic political dreams of a reunification between Denmark and at least the Danish bits of Schleswig. In that context, it's not ideal to have a German king. Still, we shouldn't exaggerate his Germanness. It wasn't like he was a complete stranger to Denmark, or even the Danish royal family. To begin with, he was named after a Danish king, namely his godfather, Christian Frederick. That's the guy who was once King of Norway for 146 days, and later went on to be Christian VIII of Denmark. He'd also lived several years in Denmark even before he was offered to skip ahead in the line of succession. In 1831, when he was 13 years old, his father died. Soon after the funeral, King Frederick VI visited his mother, and the two of them decided that young Christian should be sent to Copenhagen to receive military training to become an officer in the army, even though the boy himself had preferred a career in the navy. During his time as a cadet at the military academy in Copenhagen, Christian moved in royal circles all the time. In fact, the king and his wife, Queen Marie, took a special interest in him. That was partly because the childless couple liked him, and partly because he was the queen's nephew. Christian's connections to the Danish royal family were strengthened even further when his eldest brother, Karl, married the king and queen's youngest daughter, Wilhelmina Marie. So the Danish royals actually knew and liked Christian, at least most of them. But there was at least one Danish royal who didn't particularly care for Christian. Awkwardly, it was the most important one, namely the new king, Frederick VII. The king shared his people's lack of enthusiasm for the new heir, but his reasons for disliking Christian were different from most other people's. He didn't mind his Germanness so much as his lifestyle, and the fact that he didn't hide his disdain for Frederick's lifestyle. Christian was a no-nonsense military man, very much into the straight and narrow. Drinking, partying, and sleeping around wasn't his idea of fun, and it irked the king, who lived for that sort of thing. It didn't help that Christian and his wife Louise shared the unanimous opinion of the Danish elites that the king's morganatic wife, the former dancer Louise Rasmussen, was beyond the pale, not worthy of their time or attention. King Frederick would much rather have seen the crown skip a generation and Christian's eldest son, Prince Frederick, because of course his name was Frederick, become king instead of his stiff prude of a father. The king's disapproval of Christian not only made the court life uncomfortable, it also had political consequences. The heir to the throne was kept in the dark about all matters of state because the king wanted to punish him for his treatment of his wife. In this, the king had the full backing of the powerful National Liberal Party, not because the party leaders were big fans of Louise Rasmussen, they were not, but because they thought Christian was too German and too conservative. They were afraid that it would be more difficult to convince him to go along with their policies than King Frederick VII, who was so uninterested in politics. It was only when a friend and former professor of mathematics from the military academy in Copenhagen became president of the Council of State in 1856 that Christian was given a seat on the council. As you know by now, Christian became king in November 1863 when Frederick VII died in the middle of the building crisis over the November Constitution and the threat of war with Prussia and Austria. So his first months as monarch were turbulent, to say the least. But just because things quieted down on the battlefield, that didn't mean that Christian's struggles were over. Throughout his reign, he fought, not against soldiers, but against politicians, and arguably against the times. You see, Christian IX did not approve of all these new ideas of constitutional rule, power to the people, or at least the politicians, and the curbing of royal power. I think it's fair to assume that he would never have agreed to the abolition of absolutism in the same cavalier way that Frederick VII had. Christian would have preferred the gradual process outlined by Christian VIII. But we can't always get what we want, and we have to play with the cards that have been given to us. Still, it was a struggle for Christian to adapt. And he wasn't alone in this struggle. The second half of the 19th century was a time of change more broadly. I know what you're thinking. Historians always say that about the period they're talking about, because if you look closely enough at any era, you'll start noticing change. No living society is static. This is all true, of course, but the last decades of the 19th century was a time when things moved especially fast. And the difference to what life had been like a generation before put things in stark contrast. Denmark had shrunk dramatically. Absolutism was gone and democracy was taking hold, albeit slowly. The economy and society itself were changing. Agriculture was developing, but also losing its dominant role, and industrialization led to other fields becoming more important to the economy. This, in turn, led to a radical shift in the way people lived, since they started to move to where the new jobs were found. This led to urbanization, the massive growth of cities and towns, and the abandonment of the countryside. We'll get back to all of that in future episodes. But today we'll focus on the political changes, which also meant that the role of kings changed. During these years, the job description for monarchs altered dramatically, and the new kings in Denmark and Sweden had to find their footing in this brave new world where they were increasingly reduced to figureheads instead of actual political leaders. Not every king handled this shift gracefully, and Christian IX was definitely one of them. The new king was not only much more conservative than his predecessor, he was also much more interested in politics. This meant that he clashed with the nationalist liberals who had dominated Danish politics ever since the abolition of absolute monarchy in 1848. As I mentioned a moment ago, they also distrusted his Germanness, and in liberal circles, it was widely assumed that Christian IX couldn't be trusted to be a reliable Danish patriot. Luckily for the king, the catastrophic defeat in the 1864 war meant the end of the national liberal dominance. Instead, two new parties developed, the conservative right party, Høyre, and the progressive left party, Venstre. By now, the left-right division from the French Revolution was firmly established in European political culture, and that's where the names of the parties come from. After the loss of the duchies, Denmark found itself in the unique situation of having two constitutions, the June Constitution from 1849, which regulated internal Danish affairs, and the November Constitution from 1863, which regulated common affairs for the unitary state. Each one of these constitutions called for a separate parliamentary body, so now Denmark had two parliaments for the same area. Everyone agreed that this was silly, so they decided to overhaul the whole constitutional framework. The result wasn't so much a brand new constitution as a revision of the old one. But it still took 2 years to finish the job because the left and the right had a hard time agreeing. The more progressive politicians argued that the easiest thing to do would be to simply scrap the November Constitution and return to the original one from 1849. It should suffice now that the only thing left to govern was Denmark itself. But conservative politicians opposed this suggestion, not on principle, but because the so-called June Constitution from 1849 had been so liberal with the right to vote. giving the unwashed masses a say in politics. Highly irregular and dangerous, thought the people in conservative circles, not least those surrounding the king. So, the revised constitution, promulgated on July 28, 1866, was a compromise reached by conservative landowners, the National Liberals, and parts of the farmers. The Danish parliament, called the Riksdag, would still have two chambers, the Folketing and the Landsting. As far as the Folketing was concerned, the rules set down in the June constitution were essentially preserved, so that the principle of direct elections and broad suffrage was maintained. The left party, Venstre, with its support in town and cities and among small landowners, dominated the Folketing. The decisive change concerned the other chamber, the Landsting. The electoral rules for this chamber were more influenced by the November Constitution of 1863, and it made it more conservative, dominated by the landed gentry. The elections were indirect, and the right to vote was restricted to those with most land, tilting the Landsting in a conservative direction. Furthermore, the king was allowed to handpick 12 of the 66 members of the Landsting, who he appointed for life, without them having to go through the undignified process of being voted into office. As if that wasn't enough, another 27 seats were reserved for the largest taxpayers in Denmark. Through these rules, the Conservatives were guaranteed at least 39 of 66 seats in the Landsting before the voting had even started. The result was that the two chambers of the Riksdag were put in diametrically different political courses. But since the revised constitution of 1866 didn't provide any clear instructions on how conflicts between the Folketing and the Landsting should be resolved, the result was years of political struggle between left and right. This increasingly acrimonious conflict characterized Danish politics for half a century, but in the end it laid the foundation for the modern political structure that Denmark has today. The leading man in Danish politics for many of these years was a rich landowner called Jacob Brønum Scavenius Estrup. To save you from my horrible Danish pronunciation, I'll just call him Estrup from now on. He was an arch-conservative who described extended voting rights as one of the worst inventions of all time. He thought that only those who owned land should have the right to vote. But interestingly, he didn't think you had to own lots of land, only that you owned a piece of Danish soil. Even more interestingly, he didn't want rich people who weren't landowners to have the right to vote, because they could just take their fortunes and leave Denmark. Only those who were invested in the land should have the right to decide the fate of that land. From 1865 until his death, Estrup was a member of the Landsting, not elected, but one of those chosen by the king. So I guess he technically was elected by one person. One of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, Estrup remained in power for so long was that he had the full support of King Christian IX. Estrup didn't have the support of that many others, though, at least not the majority in the Folketing, so his government struggled to pass legislation. Politicians from Venstre, as well as many intellectuals, wanted to introduce the principle of parliamentarism in Denmark. That's the system where government is dependent on the support of a majority in parliament to govern. The moment the government loses this majority, it can no longer function and usually has to resign. This was the established principle in Britain, and the Norwegians were also fighting a successful war of attrition against the king in Stockholm to introduce the principle of parliamentarism in the Storting. The king was against this initiative, since it would rob him of the right to choose which conservative aristo should run the country in his name. The members of Høyre also argued against parliamentarism. They insisted on the king's right, enshrined in the new constitution, to form a government independent of the distribution of the seats in parliament. They made their argument on principle, not at all based on the fact that they rarely were even close to enjoying a majority in the Riksdag. Things heated up in 1872 when Venstre won an absolute majority in the Folketing, but the king refused to even consider letting them form a government. Instead, he let Estrup continue as if nothing had happened, and the same old conservative landowning members of the government, with the help of the same old landowning members of the Landsting, could still block Venstre from any real political influence. The situation was getting slightly absurd, and the exasperation was growing among liberals and other progressives. When Estrup continued to refuse to recognize that the parliamentary reality should have any influence whatsoever on the makeup of the government or on politics, the Folketing members from Venstre decided that enough was enough. In 1875, they reacted by refusing to vote for the government's budget. This was a big problem, since Denmark, like most countries, needed a budget to function. Without any approved budget, the government would collapse. But Estrup just doubled down. He went to his BFF, King Christian, and asked him to trigger a paragraph in the 1866 constitution that gave the king the right to implement provisional laws, and that way he got the budget approved. And this era of Danish politics got its name, the Provisional Period. This system, when the king had to get directly involved, was a little messy, but Christian IX didn't particularly mind this setup. Just like Estrup, he was deeply distrustful of democracy and thought the new constitution had given too many people the right to vote. To his mind, it was good and proper that the richest landowners would run the country, since they were the most sensible and had the most to lose from foolish policy. The following years, the tension grew further in Danish politics and in society more broadly. The left had a crushing majority of the people behind them, but no political power. This frustrating situation also created tension within the party between moderates who wanted to appease the conservatives by adapting more to their positions, and radicals who wanted to go even further in a more progressive direction. At the same time, the government and Estrup pushed ahead with their conservative agenda. One of Estrup's main projects was a massive defensive system surrounding Copenhagen, criticized by the left for basically ignoring the rest of the country. The left answered by setting up sports and rifle associations, at least nominally, to protect the parts of the country that didn't fit within the new fortification system. Estrup saw these armed units loyal to the left as a political threat and answered by setting up a corps of mounted gendarmes. The potential for political violence was in the air, and Estrup himself was even the victim of an assassination attempt in 1885. Instead of taking this as a sign that he needed to de-escalate things, Estrup responded by restricting the press and the right for regular citizens to own arms. He also increased the power of the police. These measures worried some, who felt Denmark was backsliding into an authoritarian society. Despite Estrup's pig-headed insistence on his right to form a government as long as that's what the king wanted, this position became trickier to justify as his support dwindled. Even though he had curtailed the press, his party, Høyre, continued to shrink for every election, and they won fewer and fewer seats in the Riksdag. In this situation, it's not surprising that people started to worry about some sort of dramatic event, either a coup that would put an end to the constitutional experiment, or a revolution that would sweep away not only Estrup, but maybe even the king. Had this been the French history podcast, that would definitely have happened. But this was Denmark, not France. So, in the 1890s, the conservatives realized that their electoral support now was so minuscule that they had to start to compromise with Venstre. And the moderates within Venstre were happy to work together with the conservatives as long as they would have a say in the shaping of policy and legislation. Estrup didn't particularly like this development, and he took an increasingly passive role in the Riksdag during these years. In 1894, on the same day as the government managed to pass the annual budget with the support of Venstre, Estrup announced that he would resign. But even though this was a de facto victory for the principle of parliamentarism, Estrup, who still hated that principle, reeking of democracy, insisted it had nothing to do with his resignation. He even clung to his post for a few extra weeks just to demonstrate that he didn't quit just because the majority in the Riksdag wanted him to. It wasn't until 1901 that parliamentarism was officially accepted as the basis for forming governments in Denmark. That year, Høyre suffered a truly humiliating defeat in the elections, managing to secure a measly 8 out of 114 seats in the Folketing. At that point, even Christian IX had to face the fact that he couldn't appoint another conservative cabinet. Instead, he reluctantly asked Venstre to form a government. This momentous occasion, when parliamentarism was finally introduced, is known as the systemskifte, or the change of system in Denmark. The king had lost. But in his defeat, he paradoxically had won popularity. Once he loosened the grip on power, the Danes started to warm up to him, recognizing his many redeeming qualities, despite the fact that he was a German. Another forum where Christian was popular was the European royal marriage market. The king and his wife, Queen Louise of Hesse-Kassel, had 6 children. These 6 are known for how well they did for themselves in life. Even compared to other royals, these children managed to improve their position and thereby also strengthen the prestige of the Glücksburg dynasty. The firstborn, a son, who obviously had to be named Frederick, succeeded his father as King of Denmark. That's hardly surprising and not much of an achievement in a hereditary monarchy. But child number 2, a girl called Alexandra, managed what her father had failed to do and married into the British royal family when she became the wife of Edward, the Prince of Wales. When he succeeded his legendary mother, Queen Victoria, he became Edward VII and she, Queen Alexandra. The third child, also a daughter, married even posher when she bagged the future Emperor of Russia, Alexander III. Her name was Dagmar, but she had to change it, and in Russia she became Maria Fyodorovna. She lived a long and interesting life, perhaps a little too interesting, as she became caught up in the Russian Revolution in 1917. Child number 4 was a boy called William. He too had to change his name when he was upgraded from Prince of Denmark to King of Greece in 1863. Greece had become independent from the crumbling Ottoman Empire a few years before, and after having experimented with republican rule and tried a Bavarian prince as king, they settled on the second son of Christian IX. The reason everyone could agree on William/George was that Denmark by now was a small and insignificant state, so a Danish prince wouldn't automatically align Greece with anyone important, threatening the balance of power in Europe. By the way, this means that King Charles III, the current King of England, is a descendant of Christian IX of Denmark through his father, Prince Philip, who was born a member of the Greek royal family. Anyway, child number 5 was another daughter. Her name was Thyra, and she married the Crown Prince of Hanover. Unfortunately for her, though, she never became Queen of Hanover since Prussia annexed the kingdom in 1866. But since the Hanoverians had connections to the British royal family, she was also the Duchess of Cumberland. But since her husband fought on the German side in the First World War, they were stripped of their British title in 1917. The 6th and last child, Valdemar, could be seen as the black sheep of the bunch because he never improved on his title as Prince of Denmark that he was given at birth. But that wasn't his fault, though. Just like his brother William, he actually was offered a throne in the Balkans when the Bulgarians were looking for someone to make Tsar of Bulgaria. But his father, King Christian, stepped in and refused to let Valdemar accept the job, and it went to Alexander of Battenberg instead. Still, with 4 children on European thrones, Christian IX got the nickname the father-in-law of Europe. Not too shabby for someone who started his life as the 4th son of a marginalized ducal dynasty. And even though Christian IX had had a rather inauspicious start to his reign, forced into a war he didn't want, against his country of birth no less, and then continued to antagonize the Danes for years by propping up a deeply unpopular conservative government, toward the end of his life he did gain popularity. When he and Queen Louise celebrated their golden wedding anniversary in 1892, the king was touched and a little surprised by the warm and enthusiastic reaction he and Louise received from the Danes. As I mentioned already, this was partly thanks to him giving up the fight and letting the results of the elections decide who would govern Denmark. But another factor was the force of habit. Christian IX was king of Denmark for a very long time. He spent 42 years on the throne, from 1863 to 1906. Well, that's all I had for you today. In case you felt this episode was a little heavy on royal and political history, and you belong to that group of feinschmeckers who don't think that that sort of thing is real history, I have good news for you. Next time, we'll have a look at the more structural changes that swept over Scandinavia with an accelerating speed in the 19th century. We'll get into all kinds of cool stuff like agricultural reforms, industrialization, and migration patterns. It'll be a blast. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.